It was a Tuesday evening when the first crack in my perception of our perfect life appeared. The air outside had grown cool with the early signs of autumn, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly scrolling through the news on my phone, waiting for Charlotta to come home. She'd told me earlier that morning she had a meeting after work, nothing unusual in that her job often required late nights or last-minute catch-ups with clients. But tonight felt different. It was already well past 9 p.m. and she hadn't responded to my texts in over an hour. That wasn't entirely out of character, though. Charlotta often got caught up in work or was engrossed in some social event, her attention laser-focused. But still, a small, nagging feeling started to grow in the pit of my stomach. You know how it is when something just feels off, even if you can't put your finger on it. It was that kind of night. When she finally walked through the front door, I heard it immediately. The energy around her was electric. Her footsteps were lighter, almost bouncing, and she had this strange, almost too bright look in her eyes as she came into the kitchen. There was this glow about her as if she'd just walked out of some exciting adventure that she wasn't ready to talk about yet. I could feel the warmth of her excitement even before she said anything, but that warmth, instead of comforting me, sent an unexpected chill down my spine. "Hey," I said casually, trying to ignore the gnawing unease. "How was your meeting?" She paused for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Her eyes flicked over to me briefly, and there was something guarded there, like she was measuring her words before she spoke. Then she gave me that tight-lipped smile, the one she used when she wanted to close a conversation before it had even started. "Oh, it was fine," she said, too quickly, like she was eager to move past the topic. "Just some routine stuff, nothing important." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach tightened. Fine. Routine. Nothing important. But the way she said it felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. I watched as she moved about the kitchen, her movements sharp and efficient, like she was still full of adrenaline. She didn't linger like she usually would after a long day. Instead, she seemed distant, almost disconnected. Her eyes never quite met mine, flitting away as if there was something just out of view that demanded her attention. "What's for dinner?" she asked absent-mindedly, already heading toward the fridge. The question felt more like an afterthought, a placeholder for real conversation. As she rummaged through the fridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the way she was acting, there was something deeper. She was still too keyed up, like her mind was racing a mile a minute, even as she tried to appear calm. Her excitement didn't feel like the result of a successful business meeting. No, it was something more personal, more intimate. I watched her from across the room, feeling more like a stranger in my own house than her husband. There was something about the way she held herself that night, something closed off as if she had constructed an invisible wall between us. And then there was her phone, always with her. It had become her constant companion in the last few weeks, an extension of her hand. Tonight was no different. As she moved around the kitchen, she kept her phone close by, glancing at it every few minutes. She used to leave it lying around, sometimes even forgetting where she'd placed it, but not anymore. Recently, she'd taken to carrying it with her wherever she went, checking it frequently, and tonight was no exception. Every time the screen lit up, her attention snapped to it. She didn't open any messages, at least not in front of me, but her eyes darted toward the phone whenever it buzzed, like she was waiting for something, or someone. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral and casual. But the question hung between us, weighted with the suspicion I hadn't voiced yet. Her response was immediate but cold, her voice devoid of warmth. "Yeah, fine," she said again, but this time there was a sharpness to it, an edge that hadn't been there before. She didn't look at me when she said it. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and closed it with a little too much force, as though she needed an outlet for whatever tension was bubbling beneath the surface. I watched as she turned on her heel and left the kitchen, heading upstairs without another word. She was going to the bedroom, where she usually disappeared for long phone calls or text exchanges, shutting the door behind her like it was a barrier she needed to keep between us. A heavy silence settled in the room as I sat there alone, staring at the place she had just been. My mind was racing now, trying to piece together the fragments of what I had just witnessed. The guarded responses, the constant attachment to her phone, the way she had avoided my eyes, it all pointed to something. Something I didn't want to think about, but couldn't ignore any longer. There was a distance between us now, one I hadn't noticed until it was too late. A distance that seemed to grow with each passing day. Each night she came home later than usual, and each time she brushed off my questions with a vague, non-committal answer. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong, and whatever it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. A week passed, but the tension between Charlotta and me lingered like a low, constant hum in the background, barely audible but impossible to ignore. I tried to brush off my suspicions, telling myself that maybe I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid. But every little thing she did seemed to feed my doubts, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. Charlotta had been spending more time away from home, her excuses growing vaguer with each passing day. "I've got to stay late at work," she'd say, or, "I'm meeting some colleagues for dinner." At first, I believed her, or at least tried to. But the way she rushed out of the house in the mornings, the way she avoided my eyes whenever I asked about her day, it all started to form a pattern I couldn't ignore. Then came that night. It was a Friday, just after sunset. The air outside was crisp, and the last traces of daylight were fading into a darkening sky. Charlotta had told me she'd be working late again, so I wasn't expecting her home until much later. Restless, and with nothing to do, I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. The street was quiet, only a few cars passing by now and then, and the soft hum of distant city sounds filled the silence. I leaned against the fence, staring absently at the street when I saw her. At first, I didn't recognize her. The woman walking down the block, arm in arm with a man, looked too carefree, too relaxed to be Charlotta. But then, as they approached a car parked a few feet away, the street light above them flickered on, casting a soft glow over them both. My heart nearly stopped as I realized it was her. There she was, laughing, her head tilted back, her hand casually resting on the arm of a young man I had never seen before. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a casual air about him, the kind of guy who looked like he didn't have a care in the world. He was wearing jeans and a leather jacket, the kind of jacket Charlotta had always made fun of. Yet there she was, leaning into him, completely at ease. It hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just walking together, they were together. The way they moved, the easy intimacy between them, it was obvious. They were more than just colleagues, more than just friends. There was a closeness, a familiarity, that went far beyond anything Charlotta had ever mentioned. My mind went blank for a moment, and all I could do was stand there, frozen, watching them as they reached the car. He opened the door for her with a smile, and she slid into the passenger seat like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt the blood drain from my face, my skin going cold despite the warmth of the evening. I wanted to look away, wanted to turn around, and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as if some invisible force was holding me there, forcing me to watch as this stranger, this young, confident man, took my wife away. Charlotta didn't glance around, didn't check to see if anyone was watching. She was too caught up in whatever was happening between her and this man. Too lost in the moment to care. And then they drove off, the taillights of the car disappearing into the distance, leaving me standing there, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from beneath me. My stomach twisted into knots, the reality of what I had just witnessed settling in like a heavy weight on my chest. My suspicions were no longer just vague worries gnawing at the back of my mind. I had seen it with my own eyes. Charlotta was with someone else. For a brief moment, I considered calling her, confronting her right then and there, demanding an explanation. But the words never made it to my lips. Something inside me stopped me from acting on impulse, from creating a scene. A part of me, the rational part, wanted to understand the full picture before I let my emotions take over. I didn't want to jump to conclusions or act out in anger without knowing all the details. Instead, I stood there for a few more minutes, staring blankly at the spot where their car had been. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. But no matter how I tried to spin it, there was no mistaking what I had seen. They were too comfortable with each other, too intimate for it to be a casual encounter. It was more than a friendship, more than a simple work connection. The realization settled over me like a dark cloud, and I felt a deep, cold emptiness spread through my chest. Everything I had known, or thought I had known, about our marriage, about Charlotta, was suddenly in question. But even amid that pain, that betrayal, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her just yet. I wasn't going to let her know that I had seen them together. Not until I had all the answers. I needed to see how far this went, and how deep her deception ran. So I turned around and walked back inside, my hands trembling, my mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. I would wait. I would watch it. And when the time was right, I would act. For now, though, I would stay silent, keeping what I had seen to myself. As the pieces of my world slowly began to unravel, the moment I saw Charlotta with that young guy, laughing and leaning into him, the foundation of my world cracked, but I didn't let it crumble completely. Instead of rushing to confront her, to demand explanations, I let the anger simmer, boiling just beneath the surface. Anger can be a powerful thing, but if you act too quickly, you waste its potential. No, this needed to be handled carefully. Charlotta was clever, but I was going to be smarter. That night, after witnessing her betrayal, I sat in silence for hours, replaying the scene in my mind. Every detail was burned into my memory. The way she smiled at him, the casual intimacy of their body language, the way she didn't even glance around to see if anyone was watching. She was so confident, so sure that I wouldn't find out. That arrogance would be her downfall. But what was the point of a confrontation? She'd likely lie, spin some story, and deny everything. I'd be the paranoid husband. Jealous and overreacting. No, I needed to hit her where it would hurt the most, her reputation. Charlotta prided herself on being the perfect wife, the flawless hostess, and the friend everyone could count on. In her world, appearances were everything. And I knew that if I could destroy the image she had carefully built for herself in front of her friends, it would shatter her more than any argument ever could. A plan began to take shape in my mind, piece by piece. It had to be precise, methodical, and executed without her ever suspecting until it was too late. I wouldn't just expose her affair. I would unravel the perfect version of herself she projected to everyone around us. To do that, I needed someone on the inside, someone who could help me navigate Charlotta's social world and deliver the final blow. That someone was Kitty, her best friend. Kitty and I had known each other for years. She was always around, part of our inner circle. And over time, I'd noticed little things, glances that lingered too long, smiles that seemed just a bit too warm. She was always friendly, of course, but there was an underlying energy between us, something that hovered just beneath the surface. I never acted on it before because I had no reason to, but now? Now that connection was the key to my plan. I started small, casual conversations when Charlotta wasn't around. A compliment here, a joke there. We would see each other at social gatherings, and I made sure to pay just a little more attention to Kitty each time. Nothing too obvious, just enough to plant the seed. I'd touch her arm lightly when we talked, lean in a bit closer than necessary, and hold her gaze a moment longer than I should. It didn't take long for her to respond. Kitty was sharp. She noticed the changes, and she liked them. I could see it in the way she began to gravitate toward me more, the way she laughed a little too loudly at my jokes or the way her eyes lingered on mine when we talked. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, at least not from me. Charlotta was always the one who commanded the spotlight, the one people admired. Kitty, on the other hand, had always been in her shadow. But now I was pulling her out into the light, and it felt good for her. I could see it. As the weeks went by, I intensified my efforts. I started texting her, harmless at first, just checking in, seeing how she was doing. It wasn't long before our conversations became more frequent and more personal. She'd talk about her frustrations, about how difficult it was sometimes being friends with someone like Charlotta, who always had to be perfect. I listened, offered support, and subtly hinted that I understood her in ways others didn't. One night, we found ourselves alone at a party. Charlotta was off somewhere, probably with him, and Kitty and I were outside on the patio. The night air was warm, and the conversation flowed easily between us. I let the silence stretch out for a moment, then reached over and lightly touched her hand. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes searching mine for something. I could see the conflict in her gaze, loyalty to her friend versus the desire for something more. Kitty, I said softly, making sure my voice was just low enough to be intimate, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. She looked up, her eyes wide, expectant. Do you ever feel like Charlotta keeps things from you? I asked, choosing my words carefully. Like maybe there's more going on than she lets you see? Kitty blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yeah, sometimes, she admitted. I mean, she can be secretive. But I've always figured that's just how she is, you know. Private. I leaned in a little closer, my voice dropping even lower. What if there's more to it than that? What if she's hiding something bigger? She frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? I paused for effect, making sure she felt the weight of what I was about to say. I think Charlotte has been seeing someone else, I said quietly. The words hanging in the air between us. Kitty's eyes widened, shock and disbelief flickering across her face. No way. She wouldn't. I've seen it, I said, my voice steady. I didn't want to believe it at first either, but I've seen the signs. I just didn't know who to talk to about it. Kitty's face fell, and I could see the hurt in her eyes, not just for me, but for herself. She had trusted Charlotta and believed in her image of perfection just as much as everyone else. But now, that image was starting to crack, and Kitty was caught in the middle. I'm telling you this because I don't know what else to do, I continued, my voice soft and vulnerable. You're the only person I can trust with this. I need to know if you've seen anything, if you've noticed anything strange. Kitty was silent for a moment, her mind racing. Then, almost reluctantly, she nodded. I've had my suspicions, she admitted quietly. I didn't want to say anything, but, yeah, there have been times where I thought something was off. She's been acting weird lately. I nodded, letting her words sink in. She was hooked now, fully invested in this new version of reality I was presenting to her. And that's when I knew my plan was working. Kitty was on my side, and with her help, I would destroy the facade that Charlotta had worked so hard to maintain. Over the next few days, our relationship grew even closer. Kitty became my confidant, my ally in this quiet war one was waging. And soon, when the time was right, I would use her to deliver the final blow. As my relationship with Kitty deepened, the tension between us gradually dissolved, replaced by an unspoken trust that neither of us had anticipated. It didn't happen overnight, but with every text message, every shared glance, and every whispered conversation, Kitty became more and more involved in my plan. The connection between us had evolved from a casual friendship into something more intimate, more conspiratorial. And with that intimacy came the truth I had been waiting for. One evening, after weeks of playing our careful game, Kitty and I found ourselves alone again. It was late, the night sky dark and still, and we had met at a small, quiet cafe, far enough from familiar eyes that we wouldn't be interrupted. Over cups of coffee, the conversation turned to Charlotta, as it often did these days. Kitty, I said, lowering my voice as I leaned in slightly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. She nodded, her gaze steady as if she already knew what I was going to ask. Do you know anything more about Charlotta and this guy she's been seeing? The words felt bitter on my tongue, but I kept my tone calm and measured. Kitty hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. There was a pause, a flicker of guilt in her eyes before she finally sighed and looked up at me. I wasn't sure if I should tell you, she began slowly, her voice soft, almost apologetic. But, yeah, she's been seeing him for a while now. The confirmation hit me like a punch to the chest. Even though I had already known. Hearing Kitty say it out loud made it real in a way that my suspicions never had. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay composed. This was what I needed, validation, proof that I wasn't imagining things. How long? I asked quietly, the words barely more than a whisper. Kitty glanced down at her hands, as if ashamed to admit it. A few months, I think. Maybe longer. I didn't know for sure at first, but I saw them together a couple of times. And then, she told me. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. Charlotta had told Kitty? She had confided in her best friend about her affair, fully aware of what it meant. The betrayal cut deeper than I had anticipated. I didn't know how to bring it up to you, Kitty continued, her voice faltering. I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to ruin everything, you know? And then, when you started talking to me, I realized you already knew. I nodded slowly, processing her words. Kitty had been caught between her loyalty to Charlotta and her growing affection for me. And now she had chosen a side. My side. That was all I needed to hear. What are we going to do? Kitty asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with worry. I met her gaze, my expression firm. We're going to expose her. In front of everyone. Kitty blinked, surprised, but after a moment, she nodded. I could see the hesitation fading, replaced by a growing resolve. She was ready to help me. She wanted to be part of this. Okay, she said, her voice steady now. But how? And just like that, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Kitty and I spent the next few days crafting the perfect plan. It had to be subtle, calculated, and executed flawlessly. This wasn't just about catching Charlotta in the act. It was about making sure her entire facade crumbled in front of everyone she cared about. The goal wasn't just to expose her, it was to humiliate her in the same social circle where she had always played the role of the perfect wife, the admired friend. We decided to host a party at our house. It wasn't unusual. Charlotta and I had thrown plenty of gatherings before, and it would be the perfect opportunity to gather all of our closest friends in one place. But this time, there would be a hidden element, something Charlotta would never see coming. I reached out to an old friend of mine, Tom, who had a knack for tech. We arranged for him to set up a hidden camera in the living room, discreetly placed among the decor. It was small enough that no one would notice but powerful enough to capture every detail of the night. Tom was on board the moment I explained what I was planning. He didn't like Charlotta much, either. Once the camera was in place, we set the date for the party. Invitations were sent out to all of our closest friends, including Charlotta's inner circle. And, of course, Kitty made sure to subtly nudge Charlotta into inviting her young lover as well. Charlotta, thinking she was in complete control of the situation, agreed without hesitation. She had no idea what was coming. As the day of the party approached, Kitty and I worked out every detail. She would play the role of the perfect co-host, helping Charlotta manage the guests and ensuring that everything went smoothly. Meanwhile, I would keep an eye on Charlotta and her lover, waiting for the right moment to strike. The plan was simple but devastating. We would let Charlotta's arrogance be her undoing. With all of our friends gathered in one place, Charlotta would undoubtedly let her guard down, confident that no one suspected her affair. Kitty and I would make sure to subtly encourage her to spend time with her lover, creating opportunities for them to slip away together. Once they did, the camera would capture everything. And then, when the moment was right, we would reveal the footage to everyone. I spent the night before the party pacing, going over the plan in my head, making sure there were no loose ends. I knew there was a chance it could all go wrong, that Charlotta might catch on, or that her lover might not show up. But I also knew that we had planned everything meticulously. With Kitty on my side, we had a clear advantage. When the day finally arrived, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The house was spotless, every detail carefully arranged for the evening ahead. Charlotta was in a good mood, completely unaware of the trap that had been set for her. She fluttered around the house, preparing for the party, blissfully ignorant of what was coming. Kitty arrived early to help with the final preparations. We exchanged a brief, knowing glance as she walked in, and then got to work, playing our parts perfectly. Charlotta was all smiles, greeting guests as they arrived, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. As the party got underway, I could feel the tension building. Our friends mingled, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the hidden drama unfolding around them. And then, at last, I saw him, the young man, the lover, slipping through the door, exchanging a glance with Charlotta. It was only a matter of time now. The atmosphere at the party was a whirlwind of laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of music filtering through the air. Friends were scattered throughout the living room and kitchen, engaged in lighthearted conversations, unaware that they were about to witness something that would change everything. I kept my eyes on Charlotta, who was happily mingling with our guests, seemingly oblivious to the tension that hung just below the surface. Kitty and I had agreed on a specific moment to trigger the revelation. She was the perfect partner in this scheme, balancing the role of the supportive friend while strategically steering the conversation toward the topic of fidelity. I felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through me as I watched her work the room, effortlessly engaging everyone in lighthearted banter. Then, as if on cue, Kitty made her way to the center of the room. She called for everyone's attention, a playful smile on her face. "Hey everyone, can I have your attention for a moment?" The room fell quiet, a mix of curiosity and amusement flickering in the air. Charlotta looked over, her smile fading slightly as she sensed that something was about to happen. "I know this might sound a little cliché, but I think we should talk about something serious for a second," Kitty continued, her tone shifting to a more serious note. "You know, fidelity and trust in relationships. It's something we all value, right? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and I could see Charlotta's expression hardening. This was the opening we needed, and Kitty was expertly leading them down the path to the inevitable revelation. "Let's be real," Kitty said, her voice steady as she scanned the room. "We've all heard the stories about cheating and betrayal. But how many of us have witnessed it firsthand? Or, even better, have you ever had the feeling that someone close to you isn't being completely honest?" I could feel the tension in the room building. All eyes were now on Kitty, and I could see Charlotta shifting uncomfortably. Her expression a mix of confusion and anxiety. "I think we might have a little something to show everyone," Kitty said, a sly smile creeping onto her face as she turned toward me. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest as I moved to the front of the room. I clicked the remote, and the lights dimmed slightly, casting a subtle shadow over the faces of our guests. Then, with a flick of a button, the footage from the hidden camera came to life on the screen. The room was plunged into silence, every eye glued to the screen as the grainy video played out. There was Charlotta, laughing and flirting, her entire demeanor radiating joy as she leaned in to kiss the young man. Her young man. Right in my house. Right under the noses of our friends. Gasps filled the air, shock radiating from every corner of the room. I could hear whispers, the sound of disbelief echoing as the reality of the moment sank in. Kitty stood beside me, her eyes wide with satisfaction, watching as the faces of our friends shifted from confusion to horror. Charlotta's laughter echoed through the video, her carefree spirit on full display as she melted into the embrace of the young man. The kiss lingered, and I could feel the anger boiling within me, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was about her downfall, not my emotions. The video continued to play, showcasing their intimate moments, the way she pressed herself against him, the shared smiles and secretive glances. Each second felt like an eternity as the truth unfurled before our friends, unraveling the facade she had so carefully constructed. Then, the video ended, and silence enveloped the room like a heavy fog. No one spoke, but the expressions on their faces said it all: shock, betrayal, disbelief. Charlotta's face had gone pale, her lips parted in an attempt to speak, but no words came out. She looked around at the faces of our friends, searching for some semblance of support, but all she found were wide eyes and dropped jaws. "Charlotta," Kitty called out, feigning innocence as she turned to her friend. "Can you explain what we just saw? I mean, was that a joke?" At that moment, Charlotta finally found her voice, though it came out in a frantic rush. "No, it's not what it looks like," she stammered, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to regain her composure. We were just having fun. I wasn't serious. You can't believe this." Her desperate denials fell flat, each word dripping with the unmistakable scent of panic. The friends who had once adored her were now filled with disappointment and confusion, their glances shifting from her to me and back again. "Charlotta, we saw you," I interjected, my voice steady as I stepped forward, the disappointment evident in my tone. "You were the one who decided to have fun in my home with someone who isn't me. How do you expect us to react?" Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but she found none. The weight of her betrayal hung thick in the air, suffocating her desperate attempts to rationalize her actions. "You had to understand, I didn't mean for it to go this far," she pleaded, her voice breaking slightly. "I trusted you," I shot back, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "We had a life together, and you threw it away for a few moments of thrill. Ben, please, just give me a chance to explain," she begged, but her words fell on deaf ears. Our friends began to murmur among themselves, their expressions shifting from shock to judgment. They exchanged glances, whispering doubts and disbelief about the person they thought they knew so well. Kitty stood beside me, her face a mixture of triumph and sympathy, and at that moment, I realized that the unraveling of Charlotta's image was complete. "I can't believe you would do this," Kitty finally said, her voice ringing out above the crowd. "You had everything, and yet you chose to betray your husband and your friends. What does that say about you?" Charlotta's shoulders slumped as the reality of her actions fully sank in. The facade of the perfect life she had built was crumbling around her, and she was left standing amidst the ruins, exposed and vulnerable. As the murmurs grew louder, the shock began to transform into disapproval. Friends who had once praised her were now questioning her choices, each word cutting deeper than any knife could. At that moment, Charlotta stood alone, surrounded by the echoes of her past decisions, and I could feel the weight of the world shifting in my favor. "I think it's time for you to leave, Charlotta," I said quietly, the decision weighing heavily on my heart but feeling undeniably right. "You don't belong here anymore." With a final, desperate glance at the crowd, Charlotta turned and fled, the door slamming behind her as she stepped into the night, leaving everything she once held dear in shambles. The party had turned into a gathering of disbelief, the laughter now replaced with whispers of betrayal. As I looked around at my friends, their faces still etched with shock, I realized that the weight of her secrets had finally been lifted, but at a cost I was still coming to terms with. At that moment, I knew that I had won the battle, but the war was far from over. I was left with a mix of emotions, anger, relief, and an undeniable sense of loss. Charlotta had made her choice, and now I had to face the reality of what was next. The days following the party felt like a blur, a whirlwind of emotions that left both Charlotta and me reeling. It didn't take long for the fallout of her betrayal to surface. Our friends, once a tight-knit group filled with laughter and support, began to fracture. News of the revelation spread like wildfire, and soon, it wasn't just a private scandal but a public spectacle. At first, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction watching her unravel. Charlotta, who had always thrived on social approval and admiration, was suddenly isolated. Friends who once idolized her began to distance themselves, their conversations quieting whenever she entered the room. The whispers of disbelief followed her like shadows, and I could see the once familiar warmth in their eyes turn cold. Kitty, who had stood by my side throughout the ordeal, seemed to embody the shift in our social circle. She was the one who initiated conversations with our friends, reassuring them that their feelings of betrayal were valid. Whenever Charlotta approached, Kitty would subtly redirect the conversation, leaving Charlotta standing awkwardly, her smile faltering under the weight of rejection. It was almost painful to witness the woman I had once loved slowly lose her place among us. Charlotta tried to reach out to our friends, hoping to mend the broken bonds, but her efforts only seemed to deepen the rift. Invitations that once included her began to omit her name. She would show up to gatherings only to find herself on the periphery, an uninvited guest in her own life. I could see her confusion, her desperation as she tried to grasp at the threads of her former social standing, but those threads had frayed and snapped, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The final blow came when her young lover, the man she had risked everything for, decided to walk away. After witnessing how easily she had betrayed me, he likely realized that he was not special to her. The day he left, I saw Charlotta's world shatter completely. She came home to find him gone, leaving only a note that echoed the sentiment of everyone else who had chosen to distance themselves. "I can't trust someone who can't be loyal." Watching her lose everything was both satisfying and sorrowful. She had made her choices, but there was still a part of me that felt pity for the woman who had once filled my life with love and laughter. Now, all that was left was a hollow shell, desperately clinging to the remnants of friendships that had once defined her. She started spending more time alone, wandering through our old haunts, but the laughter that had once echoed through those spaces had vanished. Our favorite restaurants no longer felt warm and inviting to her, instead, they were filled with reminders of what she had lost. Charlotta had effectively isolated herself, becoming a ghost of the person I had known. And as I watched her fade away, I realized the full extent of the consequences of her actions. She had sacrificed everything for fleeting moments of pleasure, and now she was left standing alone in the ruins of her decisions. Friends who had once supported her were now casting their judgments, and she had no one to turn to. It was a painful reminder of how quickly trust could be shattered and relationships could crumble. Amidst the chaos of Charlotta's unraveling, my relationship with Kitty began to blossom. What had started as a plan for revenge transformed into something deeper. Something unexpected. Kitty had been my ally, my confidant, and now she was slowly becoming a source of comfort in the aftermath of the turmoil. In the weeks that followed the revelation, Kitty and I found ourselves growing closer. We shared quiet moments, navigating through our shared experiences and the chaos surrounding us. I confided in her about my feelings of betrayal and the confusion of my emotions, and she listened with an empathy that was hard to find elsewhere. It was as if we were two lost souls finding solace in each other amidst the wreckage. Our connection deepened, and soon we were spending most of our free time together. We ventured out on walks, talked late into the night, and slowly began to blur the lines between friendship and something more. There was a chemistry between us, a spark that ignited when we laughed or brushed against each other. In Kitty, I found a distraction from the pain of losing Charlotta. Yet, even in those moments of warmth and affection, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that our relationship was built on the ruins of another. I wondered if we were simply two people seeking comfort in each other, using one another to fill the void left by our pasts. Kitty had her baggage. She had been a supportive friend to Charlotta, torn between loyalty and newfound feelings for me. I could see the hesitation in her eyes sometimes, the way she seemed to carry the weight of our situation on her shoulders. It was a reminder that while we were finding solace, we were also navigating a complicated web of emotions that had the potential to implode at any moment. As much as I enjoyed Kitty's company, I couldn't help but wonder about the longevity of our relationship. We had both been hurt, and while we had found a connection, I questioned whether it was sustainable. Would we end up like Charlotta, trapped in a cycle of betrayal and hurt? Would our relationship become just another casualty of the chaos we were trying to escape? And so, with each passing day, I found myself torn between the comfort of Kitty's presence and the uncertainty that loomed over us. I appreciated her and cared for her, but deep down, I knew that our bond was fragile. Both of us had used each other as a balm for our wounds, but what would happen when those wounds began to heal? As we sat together one night, sharing a quiet moment on the couch, I felt the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. Kitty looked over, her eyes searching mine, and at that moment, I realized we were at a crossroads. I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't ignore the truth. Kitty, I began hesitantly. Where do you see this going? What are we doing? Her expression shifted, surprise flashing across her face as she processed my question. I don't know, honestly, she admitted, her voice low. I feel something with you, but I also feel the weight of everything that's happened. It's complicated. I nodded, understanding the unspoken truth between us. We were both searching for healing, but perhaps we weren't meant to find it in each other. As the silence stretched between us, I felt the inevitability of our situation settling in. Our relationship was a beautiful distraction, but it was also built on shaky ground. And as much as I wanted to hold on, a part of me knew that we were both still figuring out who we were amidst the fallout of Charlotta's betrayal. At that moment, I realized we had both used each other to escape the pain of our pasts, but I couldn't ignore the creeping doubt that whispered, what happens when the distractions fade? As Charlotta drove away from our home, I watched her retreating figure with a mix of emotions swirling inside me. She was heading back to her parents' house, a place that once felt like a refuge but now served as a reminder of her failures. Losing everything, her friends, our home, and the respect of those who once admired her, had taken a painfully evident toll. The car moved slowly down the street, and with each passing second, I felt an odd sense of relief wash over me. The tumultuous weight of our shattered relationship had finally lifted, leaving behind a strange sense of freedom. The plans I had enacted for revenge had succeeded. Charlotta's facade was exposed, and she was left alone to confront the consequences of her actions. Yet, despite this feeling of liberation, a bitter aftertaste lingered in my soul. I had wanted her to feel the pain of betrayal, to understand the weight of her choices, but watching her leave also stirred a sense of loss. She had once been my partner, the woman I loved, and now she was merely a shadow of her former self, abandoned and alone. As I stood there, the reality of our lives sunk in. While I felt free, I also recognized the emptiness that accompanied the end of our relationship. I was free from the betrayal, but the love we had shared had evaporated, leaving behind echoes of what once was. Charlotta was alone, and in that solitude, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sorrow. She had made her choices, but the consequences were hard for both of us to bear. In the days that followed, I tried to embrace my newfound freedom. But the bitterness lingered. It was a complex mix of triumph and sorrow, a reminder that even in revenge, there was no true victory. Charlotta had lost everything, and in the process, I had lost a part of myself too.